In the heart of Chicago's Greektown during the 1920s, the air was always thick with the scent of roasted lamb, olive oil, and fresh bread. It was a neighborhood of noise and motion, where street vendors shouted prices in English and Greek, and the rhythm of immigrant life pulsed from tenement to tenement. Among the clatter and chatter, a boy named Demetrios Haridos stood behind a small kitchen counter, watching his grandmother cook with a precision that could have belonged to an architect. "Cooking," she told him one summer evening as she kneaded dough with her strong, flour-dusted hands, "is about the system, not the recipe." She pointed to her kitchen, a compact maze of pots, trays, and baskets that somehow operated without chaos. "If you understand how everything moves together, you can feed anyone." That lesson stayed with Demetrios long after he left the warm kitchens of Greektown. While other children dreamed of baseball or cars, he was fascinated by flow, how food, tools, and people could move through space with purpose. By 16, he was working in the sprawling backrooms of Chicago's hotel kitchens, where lines of cooks moved like synchronized dancers. He studied them the way an engineer studies machinery. When a station bottlenecked, he adjusted its position. When meals came out cold, he reworked the timing. Before long, managers began calling him the kid who fixes kitchens. By 1939, as Europe descended into war, Haridos was running the kitchen at a major downtown hotel, serving thousands of guests daily. The Great Depression had hardened him, but his grandmother's philosophy still guided his every decision. He saw cooking as logistics, a living system of inputs, outputs, and timing. "Feed the many," he often said, "by thinking like the few." When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Demetrios was 29 and restless. He enlisted in the U.S. Army, expecting to cook, but instead found himself mired in inefficiency that defied reason. The Army's field kitchens were relics of an older world, rigid, slow, and dangerously disorganized. Meals for entire regiments were prepared in a handful of giant pots that took hours to heat. Food arrived late or cold, men went into battle underfed. The same stew might simmer for 12 hours only to be ruined by one mistake. For Haridos, who had spent his life refining systems to eliminate waste, the chaos was unbearable. He was assigned to the 29th Infantry Division's logistics unit in early 1943. His first day in the field kitchen near Norfolk, Virginia, was a revelation in frustration. Cooks stumbled over each other, shouting for ladles or coal. Water boiled over, rations spoiled in the sun. The entire operation was an orchestra with no conductor. That night, Demetrios lay awake in his bunk, replaying the day like a puzzle. The next morning, he began sketching. Using a stub of pencil and the back of an Army menu sheet, he drew lines connecting each step of the cooking process: preparation, heating, serving, and mapped the flow of movement like an assembly line. His idea was simple. If factories could build cars efficiently, then armies could feed soldiers the same way. He began to tinker. When his sergeant wasn't looking, he repurposed empty oil drums into fuel-efficient boilers. He redirected exhaust pipes to channel heat from one pot to another, saving precious gasoline. He marked the ground with chalk lines, assigning each cook a specific station and timing. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a rhythm of motion that eliminated the chaos. The first test came unexpectedly. During maneuvers in North Carolina, a sudden order came to feed 600 men in under an hour before night operations. The old system would have required 3, but Haridos was ready. He divided the kitchen into zones, one for boiling, one for frying, one for ration distribution. Each man had a task, and each pot was part of a sequence. When the whistle blew, the kitchen came alive like a machine. Steam rose in orderly plumes. Mess tins clattered in cadence. Within 40 minutes, the entire company was fed, and not one plate went cold. The regimental commander, astonished, demanded to know how it was done. "Continuous flow," Haridos said simply. "You keep the food moving, not the people." The phrase stuck. Continuous flow cooking. It was nothing official, just a Greek-American's experiment in logic, but it caught the attention of supply officers. When the 29th Division shipped to England in 1944 to prepare for the Normandy invasion, Haridos and his improvised system went with them. In Britain, under the cold drizzle of training camps scattered across southern England, he refined his design. He convinced engineers to modify portable stoves to hold multiple heat zones and created makeshift serving lines that could be assembled in minutes. His reputation grew quietly among field cooks who whispered about the Chicago guy who can feed a battalion before sunrise. But recognition brought resentment too. Army procedure was slow to change, and many officers saw him as a meddler, a cook playing scientist. Regulations forbade unauthorized modifications to equipment, and his innovations often skirted the edge of discipline. "You'll cook by the book," one supply officer barked during inspection. "The book was written for smaller wars," Jarritos replied. By June 1944, as the Allies stormed Normandy, his theories faced their true test. The invasion was a logistical nightmare. Supplies piled up on the beaches faster than they could be moved inland. The men of the 29th were exhausted, hungry, and scattered across muddy hedgerows. The division's kitchens struggled to function amid artillery fire and shifting lines. On July 7th, Jarritos' unit was ordered to feed nearly 3,000 soldiers in under 2 hours, a task no field kitchen had ever achieved. Fuel was low, water scarce, and equipment damaged. To fail would mean more than hunger. It would crush morale at a time when every ounce of spirit mattered. That morning, beneath gray clouds and the smell of gunpowder, Demetrios Jarritos made a choice. He would gamble everything, his rank, his career, even court-martial, to prove that his system could work under real fire. He began marking the muddy ground with sticks and chalk. "Boil here, fry there, serve there," he shouted. Cooks hesitated, confused, but obeyed. Pots were lined up in sequence, heat rerouted, and rations prepped like components in a factory line. The men moved with growing confidence, their actions guided by rhythm instead of panic. By noon, as the first shells thundered in the distance, the food began to flow. Not in bursts or chaos, but in a steady, continuous stream. Soldiers moved through the line quickly, laughing as they received hot stew for the first time in days. Some looked back at the cooks and saluted with their spoons. The air, heavy with steam and relief, seemed to hum with victory. When the division commander arrived and saw what had been done, he shook his head in disbelief. "You fed 3,000 men in an hour and 40 minutes, he said. "You may have just changed how we fight a war." For Demetrios Jarritos, it was never about glory. As he watched the last soldier walk away with a full stomach, he thought only of his grandmother's voice. Cooking is about the system, not the recipe. And somewhere in that muddy field of Normandy, amid the roar of artillery and the clatter of tin plates, a revolution in military logistics was quietly born. By the summer of 1944, the Allied advance through France was a blur of triumph and exhaustion. The beaches of Normandy were secured, but the cost was immense. The roads inland were clogged with wrecked trucks, burned-out tanks, and endless lines of soldiers who hadn't eaten properly in days. The official field kitchens struggled to keep up with the pace of the invasion. Food arrived late, cold, or not at all. Soldiers joked grimly that they were winning the war on empty stomachs. For most men, hunger was just another hardship of war. For Sergeant Demetrios Jarritos, it was an engineering problem waiting to be solved. He'd been promoted quietly after his performance in Normandy, his continuous flow method adopted in whispers across a few nearby units. Still, there was no formal recognition. His design existed in a gray zone between improvisation and insubordination. But in the chaos of the push towards St. Lo and beyond, results mattered more than rules. Jarritos spent his nights sketching on scraps of cardboard or the backs of ration boxes, diagrams of improved layouts for mobile kitchens, fuel-efficient heating systems, and what he called fluid rations logistics. His bunkmates joked that he was building an empire out of tin cans. In truth, he was. Each morning, he walked among the wreckage of a moving war. The smell of diesel and mud mixed with that of scorched bread and burnt coffee. Field kitchens were usually the last to arrive and the first to be forgotten, tucked into ditches or behind ruined barns. But Demetrios saw them as the beating heart of the army's morale. "You can't fight on empty stomachs," he told anyone who would listen. "You can't win a war if you're cold and hungry." When orders came for the division to move rapidly eastward, his methods faced their next test. Supply trucks couldn't reach the front lines fast enough, and fuel was rationed. The old cooking units consumed too much, and portable stoves sputtered in the cold nights. Soldiers resorted to eating canned rations, which froze solid in their packs. Morale began to sink. That's when Jarritos introduced another idea: heat exchange cooking. He modified exhaust systems from transport trucks to channel waste heat into food warmers. "If we can't bring the kitchen to the front," he said, "we'll make the front into a kitchen." Using a mixture of welded pipes, salvaged valves, and pure ingenuity, he created what the men called the Jarritos snake, a coiled line that ran from truck engines to insulated pots. The first trial was crude but astonishing. By running engines idle, the team kept vats of stew and coffee warm without wasting extra fuel. Soldiers who'd been living on cold bread for 3 days suddenly had hot meals again. The reaction was immediate. A tired infantryman lifted a steaming cup of coffee to his lips, closed his eyes, and whispered, "That's better than bullets." Word spread. Soon other divisions copied the method, calling it engine cooking. Engineers drew blueprints. Supply officers took notes. The man once dismissed as a meddling cook had become an unofficial pioneer of battlefield efficiency. But Demetrios never took credit. He saw his work as duty, not invention. "You don't win medals for feeding soldiers," he told his assistant one night, "but you might help them live long enough to earn theirs." As summer turned to autumn, his continuous flow system evolved into a philosophy. It wasn't about feeding people faster, it was about keeping them human amid the machinery of war. Every change he made had that goal at its core. He insisted that field kitchens serve hot meals whenever possible, no matter the risk. "A warm plate," he said, "is a message. Someone still cares that you're alive." That belief would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. By December, Allied forces had pushed deep into Belgium. Snow fell across the Ardennes forest, turning roads to rivers of ice. The men of the 29th Division huddled in foxholes, their breath forming clouds that froze before fatting. Supplies were stretched thin, fuel was scarce. Few realized that the German army was preparing one last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. When the offensive began on December 16, chaos swallowed the front. Communication lines broke, trucks were destroyed or cut off. Entire units were trapped without heat or food. In Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, American soldiers faced starvation and frostbite. And in that frozen hell, Sergeant Haritos' systems became the difference between endurance and collapse. He organized his cooks into rotating shifts, turning frozen equipment into makeshift forges. They burned anything that could produce heat, broken crates, shell casings, even captured German fuel cans. He built insulated pits in the snow to trap warmth around pots. The result was a miracle of improvisation, hot stew, coffee, and bread that never froze. To soldiers trapped in the siege, the sight of steam rising from those pits was salvation itself. "We'd smell that stew before we saw the smoke," one infantryman later recalled. "It meant we were still alive." The mystery stew, as they called it, became legend. No one knew what was in it: powdered beef, cabbage, potatoes, and whatever else Haritos' men could scavenge, but it was always hot, always ready. When officers asked how he managed it, he grinned. "Continuous flow," he said. "We just never stop moving." Under constant bombardment, his team worked without pause. They rotated cooking units underground, using discarded tarps as insulation. One night, when a shell destroyed half the kitchen, Demetrios rebuilt it using salvaged tank armor and metal trays. "If it holds bullets, it can hold soup," he said. For weeks, his kitchens were the only consistent warmth in Bastogne. Soldiers lined up with tin cups and shivered, waiting for their turn. He greeted each with the same words: "Eat fast, live longer." When the siege finally broke in late December, General George S. Patton's Third Army rolled into the battered town. The snow was red and gray with ash. Amid the ruins stood a cluster of field kitchens, still steaming, still serving. Patton himself stopped to observe. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. "Sergeant Haritos, sir." Patton raised an eyebrow. "A cook." The reply came without hesitation: "The best we've got." Patton nodded slowly. "Then he's one of mine." That brief exchange marked the beginning of Haritos' quiet recognition. He would never be decorated for heroism, but in the war's closing months, reports of his innovations reached the upper echelons of command. Technical officers documented his systems, engineers refined them, and by the time Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, Haritos-style kitchens were part of official supply doctrine. Yet even as his influence spread, he remained humble. After Bastogne, he refused reassignment to headquarters, insisting on staying with the men he fed. "I'm not done cooking," he said, "not until everyone's full." The war was shifting. Germany was collapsing, and the end was near. But for Demetrios Haritos, the lesson of his grandmother's kitchen still guided every decision. Efficiency was an act of love, and order was the quiet antidote to chaos. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, amid the thunder of artillery and the cries of wounded men, that lesson burned brighter than any flame. And as victory drew closer, The cook who thought like an engineer was already planning what came next, not for war, but for the world that would have to eat after it. Spring arrived over Europe in 1945, not with the scent of flowers, but with the bitter smoke of endings. Germany was collapsing, its armies retreating through ruined cities, its soldiers starving and surrendering by the tens of thousands. Amid the devastation, the men of the U.S. Army's 29th Division pressed forward, weary but alive, and many owed that life to the cook who had refused to let them go hungry. By then, Sergeant Demetrios Haridos's name had begun to circulate in the unlikeliest corners of the Allied command chain. Officers from logistics units were whispering about the Greek American who feeds divisions like factories. Military engineers requested his blueprints. And in a war that had seen innovation from radar to atomic fire, his idea that food should move continuously through a battlefield system was quietly being hailed as one of the most practical revolutions of all. In a debriefing tent near Aachen, a group of supply officers gathered around a battered blackboard where Haridos had drawn his latest design. His hands, calloused from years of handling hot iron and frozen tools, moved with precision as he sketched the sequence. Preparation right arrow, heating right arrow, flow right arrow, distribution. You see, he explained, every kitchen before this one tries to make the meal all at once. One pot fails, the whole operation stalls. But if you divide tasks, boiling here, frying there, serving there, you never stop. Food moves like ammunition. You don't load all the guns at once, you reload continuously. The officers nodded slowly. One of them, a major from the Quartermaster Corps, leaned forward. You're saying cooking is logistics. Haridos smiled. It always was. Within weeks, his model was being replicated in depots across the Western Front. Improvised diagrams turned into typed manuals. Engineers refined his designs for mass production. The phrase continuous flow cooking system appeared in official memos, stripped of his name but carrying his fingerprints in every line. It was a system born from necessity, tested under fire, and now destined to become doctrine. But Demetrios himself refused to step into the limelight. He spent the last weeks of the war on the move, from one makeshift kitchen to another, ensuring that soldiers, refugees, and even German prisoners received hot meals. If they're eating, they're human, he told his team. That's the difference between victory and revenge. In April 1945, when American forces liberated camps filled with skeletal survivors, his team was among the first to serve food there. The shock of what they saw would stay with him for life, human beings reduced to shadows, their hunger both physical and spiritual. He directed his men quietly. Small portions, warm, often, don't let them eat too much too fast, they've forgotten how. Those days changed him. Feeding the living was no longer just an act of efficiency, it was an act of restoration. He realized that every spoonful was a piece of civilization being rebuilt. When Germany surrendered in May, soldiers across Europe celebrated. But for Haridos, victory was followed by silence. The kitchen still ran, but the rhythm was different, slower, uncertain. Men packed up equipment, wrote letters home, and tried to remember what ordinary life felt like. One afternoon, while dismantling a stove near the Rhine, an officer approached him with an envelope. "Orders from HQ," he said. Inside was a letter from the Quartermaster General's office, inviting him to Washington to consult on post-war feeding systems. It was official recognition, the kind he'd never sought. He hesitated, leaving his men felt like abandoning the heart of his work, but they insisted. "Go, Sarge," one corporal said. "We'll keep the stew flowing, you taught us how." In Washington, the transition from battlefield to boardroom was jarring. The offices smelled of ink and paper instead of smoke and grease. At a conference table lined with colonels and engineers, Haridos found himself describing how the same principles that kept men alive in Bostonia could now feed armies in peace. He spoke not as a scientist, but as a craftsman. "The problem with large systems," he said, "isn't size, it's waste. Every wasted step, every wasted motion, that's lost energy, lost morale. You can build better weapons, but if you don't build better kitchens, your army will still starve." His proposals went beyond war. He envisioned mobile food units for disaster relief, modular stoves for remote bases, even assembly line cafeterias for factories and hospitals. The officers listened, some skeptical, some inspired. By the end of the week, he was assigned to the newly formed Army Service Forces Food Development Board. It was there that his philosophy began to spread beyond military walls. Civilian contractors, industrial caterers, hospital administrators, even university canteens studied his efficiency charts. They called it the Jarritos method, though the man himself never claimed ownership. "It's not mine," he told a reporter once. "It's common sense." By 1946, he was back in Chicago, starting anew in a city eager to rebuild. Using his wartime savings and a modest government grant, he opened a small company, Jarritos Industrial Catering Systems. Its purpose was simple: to bring the order of war kitchens into the chaos of civilian demand. His first clients were local factories converting from weapons to washing machines. They needed to feed thousands of workers quickly and cheaply. Demetrios installed long, narrow serving lines inspired by his Normandy layout, steam tables arranged for unbroken motion, with food flowing from preparation to plate in under a minute. "Speed isn't the enemy of care," he'd say. "It's the form it takes when you organize compassion." The system worked. Productivity soared, waste fell, and soon his designs were being copied across the country. Within a few years, his methods formed the backbone of institutional dining, from universities to hospitals, from airlines to what would become the fast food industry. But amid success, he never forgot where it began. In his office hung a single black and white photograph, a field kitchen in the mud of Normandy, soldiers lined up with steaming cups in their hands. Beneath it, in neat handwriting, he had scrawled a phrase: "Order defeats hunger." In 1950, he was invited to Fort Lee, Virginia, to advise on a new generation of mobile kitchens. There, young Army cooks studied his principles: efficiency of motion, conservation of heat, and above all, care for the soldier as a human being. During one lecture, a private asked him, "Sir, were you ever scared out there?" He smiled. "Every day, but fear is like hunger. If you feed it right, it becomes energy." The Army would later formalize his ideas as the Jarritos principles of field feeding. They became the cornerstone of combat nutrition, influencing generations of military logisticians. His diagrams were redrawn in manuals, his quotes reprinted in officer training guides. Still, for all the honors that came later, Demetrios Jarritos remained a man of simplicity. He refused medals, saying, "I was just a cook who wanted the line to move faster." Yet his quiet revolution reached far beyond the mess tent. It changed how armies, and eventually the world, thought about feeding people at scale. In the post-war years, he often visited universities to speak to engineering students, standing before chalkboards filled with equations. "You study engines and machines," he told them, "but remember, the best systems begin with empathy. Efficiency without compassion is just speed." He believed that the measure of civilization wasn't its weapons or its wealth, but its ability to feed its own, and even its enemies, with dignity. In the twilight of his life, when journalists asked him what drove him through those freezing nights in Bastogne or those frantic hours in Normandy, his answer was always the same: "I just didn't want anyone to go hungry. That's how wars start. That's how peace begins." The boy from Greektown who learned that cooking is about the system, not the recipe, had built something larger than a kitchen. He had built a philosophy, one that would outlast him, one that proved that even in the machinery of war, there is room for mercy, order, and care. And in that order, soldiers found not just food, but the taste of hope itself. By the 1960s, America had moved into a new era, one of prosperity, conflict, and constant motion. Highways cut across the continent, factories thrummed with endless production, and a new rhythm of life demanded speed above all else. In that world of acceleration, the quiet wisdom of Demetrios Jarritos, the Greek-American cook who had once saved starving soldiers in frozen forests, began to find new meaning. At 60, Jarritos had long since traded his field apron for a suit and clipboard, but the grease and smoke of the war years never left his hands. The same logic that once guided a field kitchen in Bastogne now drove cafeterias, corporate dining halls, and the burgeoning fast food industry. His philosophy, that efficiency was a moral act, not just a mechanical one, echoed in every production line that served food to millions. When a journalist from Life magazine visited his Chicago offices in 1964, she found him walking the factory floor of his catering company, stopwatch in hand, marking the movement of ladles and trays. He still spoke like a soldier, crisp and to the point. "See there," he said, pointing to a server passing a plate down the line. "That's one motion wasted. Every wasted motion is a man left hungry somewhere." To outsiders, he seemed obsessed with precision. But for Jarritos, precision was compassion made visible. It was the difference between chaos and care, between an army fed and an army faltering. He saw the same principles at work in every large-scale meal, hospitals, schools, disaster relief stations, anywhere that people gathered in need. He often told his younger employees, many of whom had never known war, that the field kitchen had taught him everything he needed to know about humanity. "When you feed a man," he would say, "you remind him he's worth the effort. You can't build peace on empty stomachs." His company, now renamed Jarritos Systems International, supplied modular kitchen units to the U.S. military, the Red Cross, and hospitals across the world. These units, descendants of his continuous flow concept, could feed thousands within hours, a design inspired by Normandy and perfected in peacetime. During the Vietnam War, his systems were deployed again, this time under a new generation of cooks who still called him the man who made food move. But despite his global influence, Jarritos remained a local man. He lived in a modest brick house on the west side of Chicago, where he tended to his herb garden and cooked dinner every Sunday for his grandchildren. He refused offers to sell his company to larger corporations, saying, "Systems are like recipes. Once you sell them, people forget what they're supposed to taste like." In 1975, he was invited to Fort Lee, Virginia, for the dedication of a new research facility, the Demetrios Jarritos Center for Combat Feeding Systems. It was a rare moment of formal recognition from the army he had served so long ago. Standing before rows of young soldiers and engineers, his voice carried the same calm authority that once cut through the chaos of a field kitchen. "I am not a scientist," he told them. "I am not even truly a chef. I am a man who learned that the secret to feeding many is to think like an engineer, and the secret to engineering is to think like a human being. You can have all the machines in the world, but if you forget who you're feeding, you'll fail." The audience rose in applause. For most of them, his name was legend, a story told in training manuals about a cook who fed 3,000 men in the mud of Normandy. But to the few who had known him there, who had eaten that first hot stew after days of hunger, the sight of the old man on that stage was something deeper, living proof that the smallest acts could alter the course of wars and lives alike. That evening after the ceremony, a young lieutenant approached him. "Sir," he said, "they say your system increased efficiency by 300%. How did you do it?" Jarritos chuckled. "I stopped worrying about food," he said. "I started worrying about people." In the following years, as technology advanced and automation transformed kitchens around the world, Jarritos became something of an elder statesman for the philosophy of efficiency with empathy. Universities invited him to lecture on the intersection of logistics and ethics. Engineers quoted him alongside industrial pioneers like Ford and Taylor, though he bristled at comparisons. "Machines make cars," he would remind them. "Cooks feed souls." In 1983, a documentary crew from the Public Broadcasting Service filmed a short feature on his wartime innovations. They followed him through the old neighborhood in Greektown, where he stopped before the boarded-up storefront that had once been his grandmother's bakery. "She used to tell me," he said, staring through the dusty window, "that cooking was just another form of order, and order in the right hands is mercy." The film aired to modest acclaim, but among military historians and food scientists, it cemented his legacy. He was no longer just the field cook who thought like an engineer. He was a symbol of how ingenuity could humanize even the most mechanical systems. In his final years, his pace slowed, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to correspond with military research officers, advising on portable rations and thermal efficiency. When asked why he still worked at 90, he replied, "Because soldiers still get hungry." He passed away quietly in 1991, at the age of 79, in his sleep, surrounded by family. At his funeral, veterans from 3 wars attended, some from Normandy, some from later conflicts, all of them bound by a shared memory of warmth in the cold. On the casket lay a folded flag and, at his family's request, a battered field ladle from 1944. In the years that followed, the Army codified his teachings into the Jarritos Principles of Field Feeding, a set of doctrines still studied at Fort Lee and in military academies worldwide. His innovations continued to influence modern disaster response systems, airline catering logistics, and institutional dining. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not in manuals or machines, but in the philosophy he left behind that efficiency is not about speed, but about care. That systems, no matter how complex, exist to serve people, not replace them. In the museum at Fort Lee, a small bronze plaque bears his likeness. Beneath it, etched in clean, simple letters, are his words. Cooking is not about recipes. It's about how you move, how you care. The system is the soul. Visitors still pause before that plaque. Soldiers, cooks, engineers, students. Some smile, others nod quietly, understanding that what he built wasn't just a system of feeding, but a philosophy of living. Through heat and hunger, through war and peace, Demetrios Haritos proved that one man's logic, born from love and necessity, could feed millions, not only with food, but with the enduring warmth of order, dignity, and hope. And somewhere in the faint hum of every military kitchen and the hiss of every steaming pot, his grandmother's voice still echoes, reminding the world that even in its most mechanical acts, compassion can be engineered, and that sometimes a ladle can change history.